The cabin doors had just opened for priority boarding. The hum of the air conditioning mingled with the polite chatter of business travelers as they made their way into the luxurious interior of the plane. The flight was set from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., a 5-hour journey across the country. In the calm of the business class section, every seat gleamed with comfort. Leather cushions, ample legroom, and personal monitors stood ready for their guests. Clara Johnson stepped onto the aircraft alone, her soft-soled shoes silent against the carpet. She wore a tailored cream coat over a pale gray dress, a simple yet elegant outfit that hugged her like a second skin. Her dark skin glowed under the ambient lights, and a pair of sunglasses rested neatly on the bridge of her nose. She moved gracefully, with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned long ago to make herself small enough to be underestimated, but never invisible. The flight attendant standing near the galley gave her a quick look and a forced smile. Clara returned the nod politely and made her way to seat 3A near the window. She tucked her bag away, took a deep breath, and sat down. From her pocket, she pulled out her phone and opened a book she had downloaded earlier, Toni Morrison's Beloved. Moments passed before the same flight attendant approached her again. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone clipped. "Are you sure this is your seat? This is business class." Clara looked up, her expression unreadable. "Yes, it is," she replied calmly, handing over her phone with the boarding pass displayed. The flight attendant studied the screen, paused, and gave a small nod. "All right, thank you," she said, handing it back without making eye contact. No apology, no smile. She turned and walked away. Clara let out a breath and returned to her book. 15 minutes later, another attendant, this one older, more senior, approached. He looked down at Clara, his voice lowered. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're having a bit of an issue syncing our priority list. May I see your boarding pass again?" Clara obliged without protest. It was a dance she had done many times before, a quiet testing of legitimacy, cloaked in vague procedural terms. She handed it over, knowing the outcome wouldn't change. "Thank you. We're just double-checking things," he said, though there was an unease in his tone. Once again, no apology, no warmth, just the quiet implication that she didn't belong. She smiled faintly to herself and turned back toward the window. The city below was slowly melting into twilight. The sky was painted in orange and lavender, and somewhere far beyond the clouds, her real identity waited to be revealed. As the last passengers filed in and the doors closed, the cabin crew began preparing for takeoff. Warm towels were handed out, champagne was poured, orders were taken, but for Clara Johnson, nothing. No one returned to offer her a drink. No one offered a towel or a menu. It was as if she was there, but not really there. Present in body, invisible in service. But Clara didn't flinch. She folded her hands in her lap, her fingers gently resting over each other, and she waited. She wasn't here to complain. She wasn't here for the wine or the extra pillows. She was here to observe, and soon they would all find out who she really was. The plane had reached cruising altitude. Outside the windows, the sun was dipping below the clouds, casting golden streaks over the curved wing. In business class, the atmosphere had settled into hushed comfort, laptops open, headsets on, glasses clinking softly with wine and sparkling water. But at seat 3A, silence hung heavy. Clara remained composed. Her posture was dignified, hands folded neatly on her lap. But anyone who truly looked would notice the subtle tension in her shoulders, the practiced calm of someone who had learned long ago how to shrink herself in spaces that were never designed with her in mind. No one came to take her drink order. No one offered her the warm towel that had been handed to every other passenger in her row. No one asked if she wanted a meal. Instead, they walked past her. Some glanced, some avoided eye contact entirely. Clara had seen this pattern before. She wasn't a stranger to erasure. It happened in boardrooms, in lobbies, on sidewalks. But on this flight, surrounded by the hum of luxury and privilege, the sting felt sharper. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored navy suit shifted uncomfortably. He had noticed the omission, the way the attendants floated around Clara as though she were a ghost in designer shoes. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he called to a passing flight attendant. "The lady in 3A hasn't been served." The attendant paused, looked over at Clara as if seeing her for the first time, then smiled faintly. "We'll be with her shortly," she replied. but they didn't come. The man glanced at Clara, who met his eyes and gave him a small, grateful nod. She appreciated his decency, but she had not boarded this flight hoping for a savior. She had come with a purpose. Hidden in plain sight, Clara was more than she appeared. She wasn't just another passenger. She was conducting a test, an observation in real time, a silent review of a major airline's promise of equity, dignity, and inclusion. You see, Clara Johnson wasn't just flying business class, she was evaluating the entire airline. As the flight continued, she noted every moment, every microaggression, every deliberate overlook, every time her needs were bypassed in favor of others. She thought of the countless others like her, black women, women of color, people who carried generations of quiet resilience, who endured these small, cutting slights with dignity, who swallowed the urge to speak up just to maintain peace in skies that weren't meant for them. Clara wasn't angry. She was patient, calm. She was waiting. Somewhere over the Midwest, the sky turned the color of velvet. City lights blinked far below like distant galaxies, but inside the cabin, the lights dimmed to a soft glow. Clara leaned her head back, listening to the hum of the engines. Her book remained unopened in her lap. Instead, her thoughts drifted to the long road that had brought her here. She thought of her grandmother, who had cleaned homes for white families in Birmingham and had never once flown in an airplane. She thought of her mother, who marched for civil rights and raised her daughters to believe they were born to lead. And she thought of herself, a woman who had fought tooth and nail to be taken seriously in boardrooms filled with glass ceilings and quiet condescension. She had built her career not on anger, but on clarity, on excellence. She had learned to navigate around prejudice like turbulence, sometimes bumping, sometimes smooth, always pressing forward. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from her assistant. The media team is prepped. Execs will be waiting at Gate 17 upon landing. Do you want to confirm the post-flight meeting with airline leadership? Clara typed back one word, yes. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit continued watching her, more curious now. He had seen enough to know something was off, something subtle but unmistakable. He leaned over slightly and spoke in a low tone. Excuse me, I don't mean to intrude, but are you all right? Clara turned to him, offered a gentle smile. I'm quite all right, but thank you for asking. There was something about her tone, graceful but firm, that made him sit back and nod slowly, as if sensing there was more to her story than she was letting on. Just then, a different flight attendant approached with a tray. Would you like something to drink? She asked, hesitantly. Clara glanced at her, then at the tray of untouched options. It was hours late, a performance now, not an act of care. She shook her head. No, thank you. The attendant nodded and moved on. Clara exhaled. The window beside her reflected her own face, calm, unbothered, unbreakable. Tomorrow, everything would change. But for now she sat in seat 3A, exactly where she belonged. And soon, everyone would know why. The cabin had grown quieter as passengers settled into their post-meal routines. Some reclined their seats and pulled wool blankets up to their chins, while others scrolled through entertainment options or closed their eyes, drifting off to the rhythmic lull of jet engines. Clara remained upright. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't drunk. Not because she wasn't offered. Well, not at first. But by the time they remembered her, the gesture had felt too hollow. She had learned long ago that forced kindness carries the bitterness of disrespect. She sat with her back straight, fingers lightly resting on the armrest. From the corner of her eye, she could see the cabin crew gathered near the galley, laughing softly over something on a phone. The same crew who had passed her by, who had looked at her and assumed she didn't belong. She remembered the first time something like this had happened. She had just become regional director of a financial firm, one of the youngest and only black women in the company to hold such a position. She was flying coach back then on a tight budget. Her assistant had accidentally upgraded her seat to business on a rewards system. She'd sat down with a sense of surprise and gratitude. But within minutes she was asked for her ticket, then again, and again. The same script, just different actors. You're in the wrong seat. There must be a mistake. You're sure this is yours? She had smiled through it, brushed it off, told herself not to make waves, told herself it wasn't worth the trouble to escalate it. But years passed. The seats changed, the clothes changed, even the numbers in her bank account changed. But one thing never did: the suspicion. Black, female, alone. That was enough for some to doubt her place. And tonight, on this very flight, despite being one of the most influential women in the aviation business, she had been tested again, not for her knowledge, her grace, her record, or her legacy, but for how her skin looked beneath the cabin lights. Clara closed her eyes. She thought about the girls watching, the young women stepping into the world, full of brilliance and hope, unaware that their light would threaten some, that they'd be questioned, second-guessed, talked over, that sometimes they'd need to prove they deserved the air they breathed. And yet, she smiled faintly, because they would also rise, not through shouting, not through vengeance, but through resilience, through presence, through ownership of spaces they were told weren't meant for them. The screen on the seat back in front of her lit up, 2 hours until arrival. She turned her gaze to the window once more. The stars were out now, scattered across the sky like a promise. And far below, the nation slept. Clara, however, remained wide awake, with a purpose as steady as the engines carrying her east. The lights of Washington, D.C. began to appear in the distance, tiny glimmers across the darkened earth, tracing rivers, highways, and neighborhoods. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seats are upright and tray tables are stowed." The cabin stirred. Seatbelts clicked. Headphones came off. Attendants moved briskly, checking overhead bins and seatbacks. Clara remained still. The hum of anticipation was building, not just for the landing, but for what awaited on the ground. She could feel her phone buzzing again, tucked into her coat pocket. She didn't need to check it. She already knew. Executives from the airline's leadership team were already assembling at the gate. Her assistant was coordinating their arrival. A camera crew from a prominent business news channel had been discreetly notified. Everything was in motion, and none of the crew on board had a clue. To them, she was still the quiet woman in 3A, the one who didn't complain, the one who didn't fight back when they ignored her. But they were about to learn. As the plane tilted into descent, Clara allowed herself a final moment of quiet reflection. She thought of her father, a Tuskegee airman who had fought in a war overseas while being denied dignity at home. He had once told her, "Fly high, baby girl, and when they tell you the sky's the limit, remind them you build the planes." She had never forgotten those words. Tonight, she wasn't just flying. She was preparing to land as the new owner of the skies they thought she didn't belong in. The man in the Navy suit across the aisle glanced at her once more. He had watched the entire flight unfold, the coldness, the negligence, the quiet strength Clara carried. And he knew, instinctively, that something extraordinary was about to happen. "Forgive me," he said softly, "but who are you really?" Clara turned toward him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled. "I'm just a woman in seat 3A, she said. "But in a few minutes, I'll be much more than that." He blinked. Before he could respond, the wheels met the runway with a gentle thud. The plane had landed, and the real journey was just about to begin. The aircraft slowed to a smooth taxi along the runway, eventually halting at Gate 17. Passengers unbuckled, stretching arms and rubbing eyes, preparing for the familiar shuffle to retrieve bags and make connections. The overhead lights brightened. Clara didn't move. She remained in her seat, calm as ever, her coat draped neatly over her lap. The world around her began to shift, restless, routine, but inside her clarity bloomed like sunrise. Across the aisle, the man in the Navy suit gathered his things. He paused to glance at her one last time, curiosity still flickering in his eyes. She offered a gentle nod. Behind her, the lead flight attendant's voice chimed from the front. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. At this time, we ask for all passengers in rows 1 through 4 to briefly remain seated after landing, as a special guest will be escorted off the plane first." Murmurs spread like ripples through a pond. "Special guest?" someone whispered. "Celebrity?" another guessed. None of them knew. The seatbelt light clicked off. A moment of instinctive movement was quickly subdued by murmured instructions from the crew. And then the cabin door opened. A man in a gray suit entered, tall, confident, flanked by two others carrying briefcases. He made his way through the aisle until he stopped directly in front of Clara Johnson. Without hesitation, he offered a deep nod of respect. "Miss Johnson," he said, "it's an honor to welcome you home. The board is waiting just outside, and the press team is ready to proceed. Shall we?" The cabin, once bustling, fell into stunned silence. Heads turned, mouths opened slightly, then shut. A few phones were lifted discreetly, though the crew moved quickly to discourage recordings. The same lead flight attendant who had questioned Clara not once, but twice, stood frozen near the galley, the color draining from her face. Her earlier confidence evaporated, replaced by confusion and shame. Clara rose slowly, gracefully. She pulled on her coat, adjusted the strap of her handbag, and turned toward the man in the aisle. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson. I'm ready." Before stepping forward, she turned and looked directly at the flight attendant, the woman who had passed her by like she didn't exist. Their eyes met. The attendant opened her mouth to speak, but Clara raised her hand, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in calm dismissal. "No need," she said quietly. "You've already said everything you needed to say." And with that, she walked past her, past the crew, past the first-class curtain, past every assumption, every judgment, every unspoken bias. As she stepped into the jet bridge, cameras flashed. She didn't flinch. She had weathered storms far worse than flashbulbs. The crowd waiting outside included media reps, airline executives, and members of her own company, Johnson Aviation Holdings, LLC. A black woman had quietly bought 51% of one of the largest regional airlines in the country, and tonight she had traveled under their care, not as CEO, not as an icon, but as a regular passenger. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for reform. And everyone, crew, passengers, and viewers, was about to witness what true leadership looked like. Outside the terminal, the chilly night air kissed Clara's cheeks as she stood behind a clear podium under the soft glow of camera lights. Dozens of reporters stood before her, recorders raised, phones live. Behind them, screens in the terminal began to broadcast her image, and within minutes, her name trended across every major platform. But inside the airport lounge, the crew remained seated with corporate supervisors. The debrief was about to begin. Clara's image flickered across a wall-mounted television as the flight attendant from earlier, Ashley, sat stiffly, hands clenched in her lap. Her mind buzzed with every detail from the flight, now replaying in sharp, brutal clarity. She hadn't meant harm. She hadn't thought she was doing anything wrong. But that was the point, wasn't it? She hadn't thought. She hadn't looked beyond the assumptions etched into her own gaze. Ashley remembered the moment Clara first boarded, how she had smiled politely, how her posture was elegant but understated. She remembered glancing at the seat number and wondering, almost instinctively, did she upgrade herself? Not welcome aboard, not may I help you, but doubt. Quiet, practiced doubt. Clara's voice echoed from the television behind her. "Tonight I traveled as a passenger, not as a CEO, not as a woman with influence, just a human being. I did this because I needed to know how your systems treat people when no one is watching. And what I experienced was not new, it was not extreme, but it was telling." Ashley blinked back tears. This wasn't just about a job, it was about something deeper, about what it meant to carry power, privilege, and responsibility, even as a flight attendant, especially as one. Clara continued, "It's easy to smile at those we recognize, easy to offer care when someone looks the part. But what about when they don't? What if leadership doesn't wear a tailored suit? What if Grace walks in with braids or sits quietly in 3A and says nothing? Will you still offer her dignity?" The room remained silent. Ashley lowered her gaze. A corporate manager spoke. "We will be implementing a full review of in-flight training, effective immediately. Miss Johnson will be part of that process." Ashley nodded, barely whispering, "She should be." Meanwhile, in the hallway beyond the lounge, Clara stood beside her team. No anger in her eyes, just resolve. She wasn't looking to fire people. She was looking to open eyes. Her presence had already done what policies and diversity brochures failed to do. It had made people see. By the next morning, Clara Johnson's name was everywhere. Business news outlets ran headlines like, "CEO flies in disguise, exposes airlines discrimination." "Woman in seat 3A redefines leadership at 30,000 feet." Social media was ablaze with commentary, some praising her quiet power, others confessing their own experiences of being ignored, dismissed, or underestimated during flights. Black women across the globe shared her story with hashtags like Seat3A, Fly with Respect, and Leadership in Silence. But Clara wasn't interested in virality. She was interested in change. That morning, in a sunlit boardroom overlooking the Capitol, she met with the executive board of the airline she now co-owned. The room was filled with suits, spreadsheets, and worried faces. Some greeted her with forced smiles, others more sincerely. But all knew the dynamic had shifted. Clara sat at the head of the table. It was not the first time in her life she had occupied such a seat, but this one was different. She hadn't been invited to this table. She had bought it, and now everyone was listening. "I didn't come here to shame anyone," Clara began. "I came here to reveal what already exists, and what I experienced, what millions experience daily, is the quiet erosion of dignity." An executive spoke up. "We agree the situation was unfortunate, and we support your review, but surely this is an isolated incident." Clara turned to him, her eyes unwavering. "No, it's not isolated, it's embedded." She stood, walking slowly to a glass board near the window. On it, she wrote a single word: assumption. "We assume our first-class passengers will be white, male, well-dressed in a specific way. We assume the people who don't speak loud are less important. We assume power has a look." She turned to face the room. "I didn't ask for special treatment. I just asked to be treated. That's the problem." No one spoke. She continued, "I'm not here to fire anyone, but I am here to lead change. And we're starting with retraining, top to bottom. This company will lead the industry in human-centered service, not just for the Clara Johnsons of the world, but for everyone." She handed out folders, each one containing a new initiative: bias training, inclusive hiring, anonymous evaluation, and a project close to her heart, the 3A Project, a scholarship and mentorship program for young women of color pursuing careers in aviation. Her voice softened as she closed the meeting. "This isn't just about flights. It's about the kind of world we're flying toward." And with that, Clara reclaimed her seat, not as a test subject, not as a figurehead, but as a force. She had always known she belonged. Now the world did too. 2 weeks later, Flight 617 from Dallas to Chicago prepared for takeoff. A young black woman named Layla stepped aboard. She wore a navy blue flight attendant uniform, freshly pressed, her ID badge swinging gently from her collar. It was her first day. Her hands trembled slightly as she greeted passengers. She had read about Clara Johnson. She had cried watching the interview. And now, thanks to the 3A Project, she was here, not just as a dreamer, but as a doer. When a middle-aged Latina woman boarded with a toddler and a bag too heavy for the overhead bin, Layla stepped in without hesitation. She offered help, a smile, and made sure the mother had water before takeoff. When an elderly black man boarded slowly, Layla adjusted his seatbelt herself and knelt beside him to ask about his comfort. She didn't just perform service, she offered dignity. In the galley, an older flight attendant approached her. "You new?" she asked, glancing at Layla's badge. Layla nodded. "First day." The woman smiled. "You're doing good work. It's refreshing." Layla smiled back. "Thank you. I'm trying to live up to the woman in seat 3A. The attendant's eyes softened. "You mean Clara Johnson?" she whispered. Layla nodded. "She made it possible for people like me to be here. So now I want to be the person who makes someone else feel seen." As the plane ascended, Layla stood at the front of the cabin, not conducting the safety demonstration. Her voice was steady. Her presence filled the aisle. Far above the clouds, something had shifted. Service was no longer about who looked important. It was about who was present. Every face, every story, every soul aboard. And somewhere, in a quiet office with windows overlooking the sky, Clara Johnson watched flight status updates from her aviation app. She smiled, knowing a new generation had taken the torch. The skies, once indifferent, were slowly becoming kinder, one seat at a time. The ballroom was quiet, except for the sound of soft jazz drifting through the speakers. Around the room, rows of tables were dressed in white linen and gold accents, each adorned with candles that flickered gently beneath the crystal chandeliers. It was the annual Wings of Change Gala, hosted by Johnson Aviation, an event created to celebrate progress in the aviation industry, its innovators, reformers, and quiet heroes. This year, the gala marked 5 years since Clara Johnson had quietly boarded a plane as a mystery passenger and changed everything. At the center of the room stood Clara herself, now a household name not only in business, but in culture. Tonight, she wore a deep blue gown that shimmered like night sky, her silver hair braided into a regal crown. She stepped up to the stage, greeted by a standing ovation. Cameras clicked, hands clapped, but when the applause died down, it was the stillness that carried the most weight. Clara placed her hands gently on either side of the podium and looked out over the crowd, not as a mogul, not as a media icon, but as a woman who had carried many names and many faces before ever being seen fully. "Good evening," she began, her voice soft but resolute. "5 years ago, I took a flight." A few chuckles rippled through the room. They knew the story. Most had heard it a dozen times. But tonight, it felt different. It felt complete. I boarded that flight not as myself, but as someone who might be ignored. Not because I wanted sympathy, but because I wanted truth. And that truth showed me what I already knew. We are too quick to judge, too slow to see. And often we fail to treat people as what they are, whole humans. She paused, letting the words settle. But what happened afterward wasn't about blame. It wasn't about shaming. It was about transformation. Clara motioned toward a row of tables where dozens of young women sat, flight attendants, engineers, pilots, all graduates of the 3A project. We didn't just change policies, we changed pathways, we created careers, we created conversations, and more importantly, we created leaders. The audience rose in applause again, but Clara raised a hand gently to quiet them. "I want to tell you something I haven't shared before," she said. The room stilled. On that flight, when I sat in silence, when I was passed by, dismissed, and doubted, there was a moment I almost spoke up, almost demanded the service I'd paid for, but I didn't. She looked out, her eyes glassy. I didn't because I realized the most powerful voice doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it simply stays present, refusing to be erased. A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. I stayed present in that seat, not for me, but for every girl who would one day sit in that seat and wonder if she deserved to be there. A hush fell over the room. Some audience members cried quietly. Others nodded, hand over heart. Clara continued, her voice breaking just slightly with emotion. "We all have a seat 3A moment, a time when the world tells us you don't belong here, and we get to choose how we respond. Do we shrink? Do we fight? Or do we stay? Graceful, grounded, and unshakably aware of our worth." She closed her speech with a whisper that somehow carried across the entire ballroom. I stayed, and I'm so glad I did. As she stepped back, the crowd rose again, this time not in applause but in silent reverence, because in that moment they understood. Seat 3A was never just a seat. It was a symbol, a classroom, a mirror, and thanks to Clara Johnson, it had become a legacy.